welcome Dr Vic Carr to the next WED event, which is taking place today, talking all things about legacy. I'm certainly not going to talk much more in detail about that because this is definitely not my forte, but we're hugely appreciative that Vic is here to join us. What we would ask, if possible, is if you could keep cameras off, but we will open up Q&A throughout the call. Over to you, Vic.
Thank you. So I'm not going to introduce myself formally, but by way of a kind of brief introduction to the topic that I'm going to speak about today, I'm going to spin you a quick dit. So just a couple of months ago, I had the honour of attending the funeral of my good friend, Helen Smart. She died unexpectedly in her sleep whilst on holiday with her family, and she was 42. So she, just like me, was a head teacher, a leader, a female leader, if you will, but she was actually so much more. In her life, she'd been a medal-winning Olympic swimmer, a teacher, a musician, a mum, a wife, and a friend to so many people. She was an active member of her family and also her circle of friends, and routinely led in organising events, trips, celebrations for all of them. Helen didn't really have any time to consider her legacy because she was actually too busy in her life doing things that she loved and fostering a love of those same activities in other people. She had no time towards the end of her relatively short life to wonder whether she had actually made an impact on other people, because she never expected to go to sleep one night and not wake up, because who would at only 42 years old? So when I sat and listened to the 4 different elements of her eulogy at her funeral, which was packed out with hundreds of people, it struck me that in simply living a good life and championing others on a regular basis, she had in fact written her own eulogy. And although acutely painful, she had made it easy for her swim team members, fellow head teachers, band members and family members to write the most amazing things about her in a eulogy that actually lasted for 2 hours, but held us all in thrall. And her legacy, therefore, was abundantly evident. And it just made me think, I wonder how many of us would be able to say that about ourselves, how many of us could in all conscience think that if we were not to wake up tomorrow, there would be people who would say that we'd left an indelible mark, created a legacy for hundreds, and inspired many more to become champions in their fields. So the so what for you is, she wasn't really born a swimming superstar, a head teacher extraordinaire, or an outstanding musician. Her excellence in those areas and the ability that she really did have to kind of search out the good and make it great in others came from many people who had enabled her, facilitated her journey and supported her to grow and develop throughout her 42 years, men and women, old and young. She may have been an exceptional female leader, but this was made possible by people throughout her life who willingly coached, advised, championed and supported her. Her skills and ability were developed as a collective result of lots of people having impact on her life in their own small way, rather than 1 or 2 people having a huge impact. And I think that that is often the way with lots of great individuals, certainly the ones that I have known. They're kind of the sum of many interactions other people have had with them on their journey to greatness. So I'll let that percolate for a while, but essentially this is basically what I plan to brief on today and forms part of my own leadership and life philosophy, regardless of the field in which I'm working, whether I'm at home with my family or with my friends. So for those of you who may have just joined, I'm Dr Carr, also known as Vic, or Mum, or Boss, or Big Sis, or Second Lieutenant Carr, amongst other less polite names, I'm sure. But each of these call signs will tell you about the differing roles that I have in my life and hint at some of the inevitable pressures that I sometimes face, and I'm sure will resonate with some of you. I won't bore you with the details of my background. I know that the bio you perhaps will have seen about me has directed you towards my TED Talk, which illustrates that kind of early history without me banging on about it. And some of you may even have read the book I wrote on leadership last year. But just to summarise quickly, I had a rocky start. I'm sure there'll be many of you listening who have also had a rocky start in life and have overcome adversity. So perhaps some of what I experienced may resonate with you, but that is not the point of the talk. This is genuinely not an online pity party. So the point is, my journey was made easier after starting school, because I was championed really by my very first advocate, apart from my mum, of course, who was my reception teacher, to whom I am, of course, eternally grateful. But there have been many people who have built upon this and helped me to become the person that I am today. And of course, most recently, in fact, are the amazing women who are so keen to build a community of diverse and supportive champions across defence that they have asked me to speak today, in effect telling me and all of you perhaps that they have got faith that I've got something sensible and valuable to say, so I better not let them or you down. What I'm going to talk about really is that we don't know when we are young just how pivotal some of those life champions are and the role that they will play in the narrative of our lives. But in recent years, I personally have been lucky enough to have the opportunity to formally reflect on some of those influential people and how they have shaped who I am and who I've become. And I shared some of those reflections publicly in both the TEDx talk and also my first couple of books. So I can say with some certainty that those people who have lifted me up rather than held me back, kind of pushed me to excel rather than patronize me. Well, you know, some of those life champions have been men. Again, the so what for you is, well, you know, looking at the range of participants, and I'm not very good yet at cameras and stuff. I'm looking at the names as they pop in, but there is representation from a range of age brackets, genders, backgrounds, and abilities. And each of you, just like me, could be someone who is having an incremental impact on the trajectory of someone's life. That impact could be positive or negative. You could be aware or unaware of it, but it's highly likely that it is happening and that your impact will continue rippling into the future, therefore affecting more than just that one life. This means that if you want to create and cultivate a good legacy, and by extension contribute to actively writing your own eulogy one day, then now could be the time, today, to begin to reflect on yourself and what you bring to the party, this kind of crazy journey celebration that we are all participant in, which is life. The so what for you then is that we are never too young to begin to reflect on the impact we've had or are having or could have on those around us in all areas of our lives. Equally, we're never too good to tell those who we can tell, I suppose, that they have had an impact on our lives, so that they feel valued and seen and possibly even encouraged to continue to do the same thing for other people. So another quick ditty, if I may, I'll only tell a couple. But almost 5 years ago, I attended a regimental dinner with the Gunners, Royal Artillery, for those of you unfamiliar with this expression. Was invited to the dinner by my good friend and referee for the local rugby league. So my daughter had been playing rugby union for Cheshire for 2 seasons, and I'd been roped in to help organise one of their inter-county tournaments in December. And it doesn't matter where you are, okay? People can spot a very busy and organised person from 1,000 paces. Anyway, I got spotted. My daughter was suffering concussion that day, so I attended the home game and on my own, despite the absolute honking weather. And having rocked up to help, it became apparent that there was only me, Sandy as the referee, and Paula, who was the person in charge, because everyone else had actually received the message that it had been cancelled due to bad weather whilst I'd been driving for an hour to the venue. So the three of us decided that we would have a coffee and a quick chat before I set off to brave the snowy weather and return home. So retired Major and rugby referee Sandy Roberts invited me to the Royal Artillery Spring Dinner to try and break me out of what I guess had become a bit of a reclusive life. And despite my best efforts at backing out, surprisingly, I wasn't a fan of socialising at that time. In the end, I did attend. And the dinner ended up being at the end of the same week that I had my first ever Ofsted in this current school, which is a whole other story. So I was actually mentally and physically exhausted, but I did go. Thank goodness I did. So we visited Stonehenge on the way down, and I thought that was really impressive. but the meal was a revelation. I had never been inside an officer's mess. I'd never seen silverware like it. I'd never known rules and etiquette like it. Nevertheless, I absolutely loved it. The pipes and drums at the end nailed it for me. It was fantastic. And during the evening, I had conversations with two really interesting people who sat either side of me, neither of whom was my good friend Sandy, which only added to my initial anxiety, if I'm honest. But those two men have since become firm friends of mine. And as you might have heard that in my TEDx talk, if you've listened to it, but they actually became really big advocates for me. They suggested that at the ripe old age of 44, I join the Army Reserves. So, having completed my doctorate and being in that kind of hinterland between one research project and the next, I'd been considering what I would do with my spare time. And although I was in the process of turning around a dramatically failing school and raising my two children, I knew that I perhaps needed something else to stop me mentally burning out and to keep my mind a bit sharp. Part of me thought I might do a part-time history degree. Part of me thought I might learn to play the piano. And yet in the end, simply by being open to opportunity and embracing those opportunities, and as such randomly turning up at an army dinner, I was given the impetus to take on the biggest challenge I had actually taken on to date. So having discussed it with Sandy on our way home, following us watching the ladies RAF rugby team play the Army ladies rugby team in Gloucester, I was inspired to actually give it a go. So I began the application online, and the very first thing I did was actually to break the system. I'd been told by the system to insert my qualifications, and trying to conform, this is exactly what I did. So after a considerable amount of time spent doing this, the system just completely went kaput, and it then took Capita a week to reset it. Who knew that rather than put all of your quals in, you only needed to input a single GCSE, but that's a different story. So at this point, I had a conversation with my allocated recruiter. And for those of you who have been through the regular Army recruitment pipeline, this experience won't be one that you're familiar with. For those of you in the reserves, some of this may resonate. And for those of you unfamiliar with the Army at all, my apologies, but bear with me. So my recruiter suggested that as an experienced teacher, I apply to the ETS, the Education Training Service. I thought, great use of my skills. Yeah, I'll do exactly that. One thing I didn't know at that point was that I would need to find a sponsor unit myself who were prepared to put me through basic soldier training and subsequently support me through what is called the officer pipeline, despite in the end not being able to take me on, because actually you become an ETS officer, and this is really convoluted, but this is because the ETS is an officer only cap badge and has no capacity to train soldiers. Interesting in itself. So first things first, I had to create and send off a CV to the ETS captain in charge of recruiting. And those of you who know anything at all about education will know that there are strict recruiting protocols that preclude the use of CVs. So therefore, I had to take the time to write my first ever one. So having emailed it off, I was then asked to telephone this captain to discuss it, which I did. So imagine my surprise when I was given 3 key takeaways from the feedback. Point 1. The ETS usually took on male secondary school teachers, not female primary school teachers. The route through officer training would likely take 2 years, by which time I'd be 47, and this really was quite old, and the training was physically demanding, and therefore I would be unlikely to succeed. And finally, my TEDx talk was in fact only a TEDx talk and not recorded in the USA, so it didn't really count as the same kind of caliber as a real one would have. I won't insult your intelligence by asking you whether you could identify the gender of the captain I spoke to, but I will tell you it wasn't male. I won't insult your intelligence by telling you to tell me how many protected characteristics she smashed in one small conversation, but I will tell you that it was more than one. But worst of all, perhaps, and not only that, but this woman, who perhaps could have been a champion for someone, okay, long in the tooth, yet prepared to put themselves out there, failed readily to take into account the MA in Equality and Diversity that I had completed whilst my children were 1 and 2, respectively. the MA in leadership that I'd undertaken whilst being a mum, special needs coordinator and full-time deputy head teacher in a large urban primary school. The multiple professional qualifications I'd taken on in support of every single role I'd done. The years of teaching on a range of MA programmes in leadership in 3 different universities. The fact I'd taught soldiers GCSE maths and English at 35 AEC, not to mention my 100% success rate at that job when I lived in Germany. She also failed to take into consideration the 7 years I had actually been asked to do that TEDx talk, completely lacking the courage to put myself out there and expose only some of the pretty dark parts of my childhood, and the fact that it's all endorsed anyway by TED and hosted on their primary site because it has to pass through their rigorous quality assurance. So as a result of this conversation, I decided that the bar to join the Army Reserves was way too high for me, and I called the recruiter to tell him so. And he was scandalised. He told me that rather than travelling the 50 minutes north of my home to Preston and to the ETS, I had to travel 50 minutes to the east, to Manchester, to see the Intelligence Corps. And the rest is history. So what? So there is toxic femininity as well as toxic masculinity in society, and therefore that's reflected in the armed forces, defence, and also the security industry. When talking about female leadership, it's not my intent to be disparaging about males or male leadership at all. For me, it's about celebrating being both a female and what this could bring to any situation or organisation, and also champion the fact that I try in every single interaction I have to incrementally have a positive impact on those around me, young or old, male, female, or any other gender. It's about ringing the changes and challenging the stereotypes, the norms, the society expectation. I'm really rejoicing in the people who've supported me actively to be the person I am and supporting others. And it's funny, I was chatting about this with one of my colleagues. He's a male head teacher colleague who's since left, and he calls himself as an advocate for women in leadership, he for she, which I think is just brilliant. And he's just coached his 68th female into a head teacher role. And, you know, as an aside, he's actually advising me how to set up and establish my own business for the future. Go, Patrick, if you're listening. But it doesn't take someone focused on only women to make a difference. It takes good people focused on developing others, full stop, to make a difference, because the ripples that we create travel far and wide. Had I the knowledge that I have now, I would have called out this harmful behaviour. We all know better now and therefore should really do better. I now have a voice and would call out that behaviour if I saw it again, and I would definitely challenge it as the destructive and negative behaviour that it is. Because if this could happen to someone like me, then it could happen to someone younger, perhaps not as robust, and perhaps destroy their career, undermine their self-esteem, their mental health, and become a barrier to their personal and professional progress, which is morally unacceptable to me as a leader and as a human being, because I carried the weight of that captain's lack of belief for 3 years. And it was only as I prepared for the parade and I slow marched up the steps of Old College to my commission did I begin to realise that I was not too old, too female, or too primary school to succeed. So there are several people who've heard that story, both at the Army Officer Selection Board and also at Sandhurst, who were scandalised. And when I went through AOSB, I was asked by the ETS colonel who interviewed me as part of my education discussion to consider the ETS. And I smiled and said, you know, politely, that I was loyal to military intelligence, which I am. And when I delivered the brief at the Army College in Harrogate, the ETS representative asked me the same and was equally as mortified. But it doesn't matter now, of course, because I guess some people like myself are predisposed to resilience, and I'm very much over it all. But that would not necessarily be the case if that happened to someone else. The so what for me was, in fact, not only did I succeed, I actually finished third in my platoon. Not that that mattered to me much, because I was convinced I'd passed at probably, I don't know, the top of the bottom third, because I wasn't an army commando. I wasn't an Ironman triathlete. They came first and second, by the way. I wasn't a seasoned reserve soldier of over 10 years, or in my 20s, or any of the other things that you compare yourself negatively to when you feel really inadequate. What mattered to me were the words of Tim. He was a Royal Signaller. He was 6'5". He definitely towered over me. And this is what he said. He said, Vic, I'm going to read this out. When I saw you, you were in our section on the first day, and I just thought you would be the section tag along. How wrong I was. You have been the section glue, the walking, talking, living and breathing section morale. You have motivated and galvanized us, coached us and mentored us for 4 weeks. Your words of wisdom and your unflappable positive presence has been a gift. Thank you. That's what mattered to me, because my room at the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst became at times the therapy room, at times the social area, the hairdressers, the laundry. I was able to give advice on everything from ironing to relationships, from dealing with bereavement to rising to the challenges that life has to offer. I listened to whispered conversations on stag, and I life coached when bullying parade shoes, and I talked with the DS about IVF treatment they were undergoing, in the same way that I spoke to a fellow officer cadet about her depressed mental state, supporting her whilst the chain of command put in a package to help keep her safe. None of this taxed me at all. For me, it is routine. Caring for and championing others and doing the right thing are activities that I'm familiar with, both as a mum and also as a seasoned school leader. And my own brand of leadership was what I took with me to RMAS, along with a kettle and, of course, lots of biscuits. But without the diversity offered to me by the reserves, none of this incremental, accidental, incidental life coaching and hopefully positive influence would have come about. Equally, I'm not a passive individual. Without me actively seeking the opportunity to support and guide, listen and befriend, then the accidental life coaching would not have come about either. The so what for you, I guess, is that each of us will be presented with the opportunity to positively influence others, no matter our rank or seniority, and also opportunity to call out unacceptable behaviour as they present. It's doing both of those things, I think, that makes us leaders, not wearing a title or holding a role or responsibility. And one of the ways that I lived this reality, in fact, was during lockdown 1, back in the day, when the world was upside down and people were feeling the shock, really, of isolation. I decided to call random people who were posting on Twitter who were struggling. And then I branched out and started to call every third person who responded to a tweet, just using a random metric, and it just grew and grew. And Paul Garvey, who's a renowned educational consultant, wrote the foreword in my first book in relation to the topic of helping and helping where you can. And also on the topic of me, he said the following, and again, I'll read this out. Damage begets damage. Maybe the greatest task of humanity is to break that cycle. There is catharsis in this book, but there is also huge hope. The steps people have to take to gain the skills and resilience to run a school are not easy. I was one of the early recipients of a vicar calls, a phone call out of a clear blue sky one day that took me so much by surprise I didn't know what to make of it. It was Vic simply asking me if I was doing okay. I was gobsmacked that somebody would do this for me. The experience has prompted me to do exactly that for others. Just go down. So I hate reading things out, especially about myself. And also who have done that. So what did he say? He said. And others too have done exactly the same. It is also why I jumped at the chance to write this foreword. Do unto others how you would like others to do for you. Karma, in my view. You get back far more than you give. Vic's influence is extending a long way, and as she says, all it costs is time. This book is imbued with how to lead well. Vic talks about her go-to strategy of do all things with love. And in many ways, you'll read a book that is not about leadership, but about growing to be the person that you are, which is, of course, everything about leadership, about compassionate leadership, leadership which is forged in the furnace of resilience, and the product is a deep empathy with what others are facing, a love for other people in our organisation. There are so many of us who come into teaching and into leadership in general, determined not to repeat the mistakes of those who taught and led us. In reading Leading with Love, you'll recognise, or perhaps you already know, that you yourself may have been driven by this. Could you be the person who opens up a world of future possibilities simply by your support? Or will you be someone who likes to close doors on others? Pivotal moments, as Vic explains. Words count, and she's right. Speaking with the ETS captain was not the first time that I had experienced toxic femininity in a leadership role. And sadly, I don't think it'll be the last. Another quick dit. Some years ago, when I was teaching in a school far, far away, the head teacher that I worked for at the time for 5 years had a nasty habit of singling out a person in the staff body each year whom she chose to challenge so relentlessly, so mercilessly, that people in the end left teaching, became mentally unwell, or simply moved on. I managed to stay off her radar for almost 4 years as a supply teacher. In my final year, however, we had an Ofsted inspection at the school. And this was quite a surprise, actually, because the school was closing down. And it felt like a real waste of resources to inspect a school that would gradually close down over the subsequent few terms. However, who am I to call into question the validity and wisdom of Ofsted? The inspectors came to visit the school about 5 months after I'd been given the full-time and permanent role of head of English. In those days, I'm told, you sometimes learned of inspections from the old boys network that existed in the inspectorate, something that was stamped out, I think, as unfair, of course, but this was one of those occasions. The head announced to the entire staff body in May that we would likely be inspected in the following term. Anyway, I'm skipping on. In the staff meeting, when the head announced the inspection, the head of English at that time stood up and said they were handing in their resignation with immediate effect. Again, this is not something that you allow as a leader. You must work a half a term notice as a teacher to protect the children and ensure there's an effective handover. But it was allowed in the end because I had done so much teaching to cover them as a supply teacher that I knew the classes as well as they did, if not better. But at that time, when they stood up and made the declaration, we were all just as shocked by the Ofsted announcement as we were by this disproportionate reaction and dramatic kind of stage exit. So the school had one full school year before it would be closing, and the rest of the term we were in. So just over 3 and a bit terms. The outgoing head of English had been at the school for 4 years in post. What then transpired, of course, was that the illusion of their leadership of the subject began to unravel. It transpired that when working from home on units of work or schemes of work or programs of study and assessments, in fact, none of these things were either done or could be found, and a ripple of kind of confusion, embarrassment, anxiety and surprise and concern kind of went through the whole school, which was already managing significant change really and much staff anxiety, as many of the people there needed to move on after a long tenure at the school with all the stability that this had offered them. So I basically had this window from the end of May to July in which to put in some measures so that the school in its final year under the head teacher's leadership and in its history of existence would not be placed into special measures when all of the carpets were kind of lifted and what lurked beneath them was exposed by the inspectors. So I decided early on that I had no interest in castigating the previous head of English publicly or privately. To be honest, if they had been allowed to run an online business quietly in the background when they should have been teaching, then that was a leadership issue, not their issue. That person simply exploited poor leadership decisions and practice and took advantage of the situation. And you know what? Many people with a few morals might be tempted to have done that. So I chose instead. They came in September, that I was not prepared to comment on what had gone before. Instead, I talked to them about what I'd done since May in order to make sure the team were given guidance and the children were subsequently taught effectively, and the plans that were in process for the rest of that year. And they were so impressed with what I'd done in that short window that essentially what they did was set me up for a huge fall and put me firmly into a painful hurt locker for the rest of that year. They didn't realise that in being complimentary, perhaps about me and what I'd done, my vision, they were essentially criticising what my predecessor had done, and thus the leadership of the school for not challenging that person. I was firmly in the centre of the crosshairs, and they made me the sacrificial victim for that final year. And victim I did become. I experienced one of the most excruciating, demoralising, demotivating, depressing years of my entire 27-year career. And even when I applied for and successfully gained my first deputy headship, rather than say, well done, she came into the staff room and simply snarled at me, well, that's your future set, isn't it? And then stomped up and didn't speak to me again. So 4 months later, my soon-to-be boss, Richard, called me in as the Christmas holidays began, and I just returned to the Wirral. And he asked me if I could come into school as a matter of urgency, and I utterly freaked out. So great was that female head teacher's impact on me, and so traumatized was I by her relentless treatment. All I could think about was that somehow she had gotten to him and changed his mind. I was convinced he was going to tell me he didn't want me after all, that my career would be completely obliterated. So I drove to school, having left my children with my mum. I was shaking from head to toe. I went in, I sat, in stunned silence, really, and he explained to me the reason why he wanted to see me. He said that when he had appointed me, I had asked him a question. I had said, "You're not going anywhere, are you?" And he had told me at that time he wasn't. He then randomly applied for a headship in Malaysia, and his wife applied for a missionary role in a Christian establishment nearby. And as the opportunity for their family was just too good to miss, he had accepted the offer and wanted to let me know that we would only be working together for 2 terms. He was planning to leave in the summer. And he said I may end up having to be acting head if they were not able to appoint anyone. And as it happened, actually, I began working for Neil, who taught me the power of 3 and what a lustrum was, which is a word the Romans used for 5 years. But anyway, back to Richard. I broke down in tears, and he was really shocked. He couldn't understand who this hysterical woman was, and I had to explain to him why. And I subsequently discovered that her reference for me was so scandalously bad that it could have seriously harmed my job prospects had I not been so good at interview and submitted a strong evidence-based letter of application and had a secondary, very positive referee, all of which flew in the face of her very scathing reference, such that it led the team who appointed me to question the validity of what essentially was her character assassination. And I was convinced it was his preparedness to take a leap of faith in me because he was just a good person. And maybe it was a combination, I'm not sure. But I wish I could say that it was just a one-off, that was just my bad luck, or it only happened to me. But I wouldn't be telling the truth. I've, aside from the fact that I've seen other people do it, I have heard myself described as intimidatingly successful or academically astute or immediately warm and likable, and then these reasons being cited as the reasons for others wanting to break me or ruin my credibility. I find it inexplicable, really, and yet this kind of petty behaviour is not uncommon. When people feel threatened, intimidated or inferior, or when their weaknesses are perhaps called out, they seek to deflect their own insecurities onto others, feeling almost powerful when hurting them. And I'm sure all of you will not have to look very far to come up with an example or two, or when this perhaps has touched your own life. But this happens with both men and women. This was a huge learning curve for me, and it was, although painful, it was really essential in terms of my understanding and my leadership journey, because whilst my experience of toxic leadership may have been outweighed in terms of ratio male to female, I think that's simply because there are more males in leadership positions than females, not because only males are toxic. What I would perhaps say on reflection, that it is always acutely painful when women undermine and determine to destabilize other women, because in a way I feel like we should be the first in line to celebrate the successes of each other as the kind of once marginalized group. But that's just a by the by. I guard against any kind of petty behavior by firstly choosing to heal myself from my childhood trauma and insecurities, and also becoming aware of my own triggers and defaults, because I feel like healed people want to heal others. And by being self-aware and perhaps self-critical and asking trusted friends and colleagues to participate in team decision making, or particularly when I know that the situation may be in a personal blind spot to me. So an example of this is maybe if I deal with parents who I know are physically violent so male parents who are physically violent to female parents or to their children, given that it triggers me on a personal level, I have to guard against any kind of knee-jerk reaction or quick, ineffective decision making that could be really erroneous. And I do that by checking with my team, and I see no weakness in doing that. In fact, it feels like the right thing to do so that I make effective leadership decisions rather than leadership decisions that I will come basically to regret, which are based on kind of visceral reactions and what I call wonky thinking. And that's what helps keep me on the right side of ethical behavior, really. Verbalizing it, modeling it for junior members of our leadership team also gives them license and agency to do the same thing. And I would far sooner rehearse those conversations in the safety of my office and go through that as a coaching exercise and see people make terrible mistakes. So, sadly, I've only recently, I think, come across any kind of disadvantage that may or may not be about me being intimidating or even female in the military sense. And this wasn't from a service person, and definitely not anybody in intelligence. But I had to walk my talk and call out that behavior, which was not easy at all. And as someone with leadership presence, and I suppose you could say a voice, as a role model and perhaps someone who lives their life with integrity, I had to do the right thing. I coached myself prior to taking action. To use the military vernacular, we would now call that action appropriate challenge. I did everything I could to behave in the same way that I would advise anyone else asking me for advice to do. So I took the time to consider the repercussions and the outcomes. I satisfied myself that I could manage any of the potential fallout. I gathered evidence. It was written down coherently, professionally, with as much brevity as possible. It was investigated and upheld, and the situation was resolved. But here's the thing, it might have been resolved, but I have no idea what the next time I come across the person I complained about will be like. That's for further in the future, but I'm sure that each of us sitting here could come up with an example of where we've worked for people who've been toxic, male and female, or female, or where we've worked in environments where we've observed toxic behaviours. I suspect there's probably quite a few of us here who have probably been passive participants in toxic behaviour in the past, particularly in our younger years, because we've not felt empowered and not felt we had the agency to challenge that behaviour. And don't get me wrong, this is not an opt teamwork brief for those in the military. Yes, I'm sure some of you will see the resonance between the content of what I'm saying and opt teamwork. However, this is not paying lip service to equality and diversity or inclusion and acceptance. For me, this is vitally important for us to be able to eradicate the kind of socially repugnant and organisationally unacceptable and destructive behaviour that results in careers ending as well as lives ending sometimes. And we can only do that by standing up, even when it feels scary. And I'm sure I'm not the only person to have come across this. Okay, so I was asked to brief the instructors at an army training centre 2 years ago by the OC on the back of conducting a brief at AFC Harrogate. And the major wrote to me and he said, and I'll read this again, "Allow me to frame the issue I have. Although a large majority of my staff here are high quality and inclusive instructors, there have been a couple of instances recently where individuals have displayed a suboptimal approach to teaching, especially with the language they've used when talking to recruits. Having seen your brilliant TED Talk, The Power of Language, and knowing your extremely strong track record in education, I would love you to come and deliver a version of your talk to our staff. I think it would be a really useful start point for a debate around the subject and will fall neatly into our staff development programme." So this was great, proactive behaviour from people keen to develop and just really refine what they were doing in their practice. So I did an all ranks brief in the lecture theatre. And the focus was indeed on how we interact, how we speak to one another, the power of what we say, and how this is magnified by also and backed up by how we behave. So given the request, given the ask, the topic and the content of what I was asked to brief about, you can imagine my surprise when a small group of male bombardiers began giggling in the seats. So I laughed and asked them publicly if they had anything to share, as they seemed pretty animated. They said no. Behind them sat their female troop commander, who looked red-faced and yet said nothing. So I've been a teacher a long time, and I've taught right the way through up to kind of, in fact, junior soldier level. So I knew that I was fully aware they'd probably been up to some shenanigan or another, but I let it go and I focused on the content of the talk. Anyway, that evening, following the second part of the day, which was a fireside chat about leadership, we were in the bar. The OC was hosting me, and the female troopie from earlier came to me very upset and pulled me to one side. And she apologised to me for not challenging her bombardiers. She was maybe, I don't know, 5 feet tall and very slight build and quiet, and she had heard them say something quite shocking about me. There was a context to the statement that I won't bore you with, but they've essentially said I would call her a clever "see you next Tuesday." She knew they were laughing at me and being derogatory, and yet she didn't challenge them, and nor did she follow it up. She was afraid that they would freeze her out and that working in her office would therefore become unbearable. I reassured her that I didn't feel let down by her at all. I completely understood. But one of her male troopies, interestingly, and I don't know whether this is a factor or not, maybe about 6'8" or so, big guy, heard her confession and said he wasn't happy about this, that they would treat her this way, or that they'd even said that about me, and he would pull them to one side the next day and support her. Unfortunately, the CO also heard. He was quite cross, and it was just a mess. It was awful. So the need for the content of the talk was obviously evident. Yeah, I did wonder about my impact, whether I'd made it worse, what it meant for all of those individuals, the CO, the troopie, and the OC, the guy who wanted to support her. And I left the next day, so I never really got to know the outcome of it. But it did make me really think about the different roles those people played, how they were all keen advocates. They wanted change, they wanted to support one another, but just how well they were able to do that with what they had, I don't know. I suppose the question to you now would be, what would you have done if you were in each of those positions? It's hard to say from here, but it's interesting worth thinking about. Interestingly as well, a year later, that really giant troopie was now captain, and he was a 2IC elsewhere, and he obtained my contact details and emailed me saying, this is what he said, I'll read it. I was a member of the audience for your talks and had some good conversations with you about your work and the power of language, amongst many other things. The value I gained from that event is something I believe my new regiment would benefit from, as I've noticed a couple of instances where we are just slightly missing the mark. May I kindly request we open the lines of discussion to tee up a similar event for elements of my current regiment at a time of your choosing. Actually, I hosted a much bigger event and split the mixed rank group into 4 with scenarios that each worked on, and then back brief the group about. And funnily enough, by then the new ITRs had caught up and followed very shortly afterwards in a similar vein. But the questions I asked were simple. What would you do if, your boss your boss was making openly sexist jokes in public and you felt uncomfortable? You said something to a colleague that you later reflected on and regretted. You were aware that your boss refused to help a colleague when they asked for career support or advice, or your colleagues were passively aggressively making the workplace hostile for someone who had raised a complaint. And it was absolutely brilliant. The back briefs we had were fascinating, but some of the problems, it appeared, still remained. And what I think this is saying to us is that these problems aren't going away. The awareness is raised and increased. We know about it, we can talk about it more, but we're not quite over the finish line yet in terms of responses or answers to the problems. Therefore, and I would urge any of you to do this who have not yet already done so, I recently made a submission to the MOD in relation to follow up about the impact of recommendations from the Atherton report. The submission window is still live, and if you can or you feel able to support the call for evidence, it's for men and women, and it's to affect change and to see things change for the better for everyone, then I would definitely recommend you have a go at that, because Whilst there are many unique aspects to the military, there are many things in the military that also happen in civilian life. It's therefore how we deal with these things that defines the kind of leaders we are, as well as the kind of human beings that we are. And yes, okay, there'll be people on here very experienced compared to me, and I'm not only newish to the military, but also really pretty much on the periphery as a reservist. So I do recognise that I don't have access to all areas or a vast array of experience within the organisation, but I have been lucky enough to visit many establishments, conduct extensive research and deliver briefs on all kinds of topics to all kinds of people, which has given me a really diverse exposure as both a participant in the military and an observer of what goes on. So heading towards the conclusion then of this talk today, I'm going to summarise really one of the most powerful, proactive and positive examples that I have seen in the British Army in my limited experience of males championing females and setting the conditions for their future success in terms of female leadership and also male allyship was at the Army College in Harrogate. So my good friend, Lieutenant Colonel Simon Fairbrother, he's not there anymore, initiated a project called Project Athena. If you've heard of it, it was a project aimed at gathering information about how females learn and are trained and are integrated into the British Army. And it began to address a gender gap that is evident throughout our world and our society. One exposed, in fact, by somebody called Caroline Criado Perez in her book, Invisible Women. And we cannot possibly hope to champion women and their place in a diverse organisation and society to create a legacy without information and quality data. And to gather data, you need so much energy and commitment, an idea, support for the idea from above, like-minded individuals to support the project and the data collection and individuals willing to participate, someone to articulate and sum up the research, and then people in positions of power and authority to take cognizance of those outcomes and implement some of the recommendations. Phew, that's a big list, but this does not deter the bravest of trailblazers, however, nor should it. So Project Athena was a 6-month-long basic training pilot. It ran from September 21 to February 22 at AFC Harrogate and involved 48 junior soldiers headed towards non-ground close combat roles in the British Army. So the project was initiated in response to the college gathering data that indicated that female junior soldiers arrived at AFC Harrogate at lower physical standards and perhaps progress less quickly compared to their male counterparts. In addition, they are more likely to become injured and therefore with a linked likelihood to them leaving training voluntary through discharge as of right. Previous interventions had focused entirely on physical development methodology, but Project Athena included kind of wider scope, if you like, so wider biological factors, looked at social context and psychology, broadening the approach. So this challenged many factors, okay, so it's hard to pin success on one particular aspect, but this does mirror the kind of best practice in elite sport, so it's not kind of unheard of. So Project Athena also aimed to address kind of social injustices faced by service women, which, as we know, as previously mentioned, was recognised not just by the college, but in the 2021 Atherton report. And this project became a kind of lens, really, through which to view the female junior soldier experience of training, and lots of tweaks and areas for improvement were identified, most of them simple tactical actions, such as measuring young women and correctly sizing them for sports bras, for them to be able to safely engage in PT, for example. That's simple. So the lived experience of so many of us women is dramatically affected by this lack of data. And this is something that could be easily rectified. And the work that Simon and his team did at Harrogate was just honestly quite groundbreaking, really. And it was based on one simple premise, that if we make a training environment effective for females, we make it effective for everyone because we make it inclusive and accessible. And there's a similar premise in education which says if we make the learning environment inclusive and positive for pupils with autism, dyslexia, for example, then we make it positive for all pupils. And this speaks to us working to perhaps the lowest and the most the least understood common denominator. And again, many of you will have been on adventurous training and told to walk at the pace of the slowest walker or the person with the smallest gait. That means everybody is then included in that walk, as opposed to them being dragged along and ultimately perhaps failing. And it's no different. So before I conclude the talk, and I have talked at you a long time, 50 minutes, I'm sorry. And before I speak about the second of the two most powerful examples I have personally seen in the British Army of males championing females, I want to just reiterate some of the points I've raised. I hope I've raised anyway. So toxic leadership is not just the domain of men. Toxic leadership is not just enacted against women. Toxic leadership is not limited to the services. It infiltrates all aspects of life because leadership is enacted by humans. We can each take opportunities to help others, to share expertise, to support others to grow and develop if we choose to, and we should all choose to. And I believe it's my responsibility, just as a good human, to be a role model to people at work, at home, in leisure and academic spaces. The fact that I happen to be female, the fact that I happen to be a leader now may inform how I role model behavior, expectations and attitudes, but it doesn't railroad or limit them. Just like any male leader, I can be firm and fair. I can observe, read about, absorb aspects of and emulate leaders I aspire to being like, and I can demonstrate emotional intelligence and also have some quite feisty, challenging conversations. I can make difficult decisions and manage finances. None of this makes me soft, weak, histrionic, or over emotional. So finally then, I'd like to do a legacy sandwich, and I'd like to talk about WO2 Stu Rigger-Ramsey, who was a member of my section, a good friend who sadly died earlier this year after a short and pretty ferocious battle with cancer. Stu loved footy, literally loved footy, and he loved trying to get other people to love it more, especially females. He had a huge TV in his house, and whenever you went round, there was always football on. As for Everton, he forced me to go with him, bribing me with as if you could turn down the wishes of a dying man, which of course I didn't. Needless to say that they lost. It was a dreadful game. And by the way, that was the humour that we had. He joked that the only choice he had when assigned to me as his section boss was to just up and die. But let me just say his sense of humour wasn't for everyone. But anyway, he came to my house the day after he'd been given his terminal diagnosis, and he asked me to buy his favourite cake, lemon drizzle, which was mine also, and a coffee. And we sat in the garden talking about life, death and the universe. And this was perhaps the last time I saw him belly laugh, when he said I was going to end up fat because he couldn't eat the cake, which meant double for me unless I was prepared to share it with the dog, which anyway. So I asked a few of his female footy friends what his impact was ahead of doing this brief, because I wanted to include him really. And he was too humble to ever ask or even know, but here he is in their words. Stu, I'll read this out. Stu GR, what an absolute legend of a human being. He was long involved in the women's game, largely at a time when many never took it seriously and never knew the impact it could have on women and girls around the world like it does today. But it wasn't just football. He would always put others first in all aspects of life and was the life and soul of everything he took part in. In terms of his commitment to football, he was involved in the women's core team from its inception in 2001 and spent a number of seasons as the Army women's kit manager and later first team goalkeeper coach. His Army football bench jacket being a favourite of his. He actually wore that to Everton just months before he lost his battle. His passing left a gaping hole across the women's game, felt by many across not only the core, but the wider service. Never the most direct or demanding coach, he used his love of the game to inspire others and his jovial persona to get the best out of the ladies. We were never the most competitive, but we are renowned as the team that has the most spirit and the most fun. He would always be there for the ladies' team. Whenever managers left on postings, promotions, end of service, Stu would always step in and fill a gap, taking the pressure off the senior players, allowing them to focus on their game, whilst he picked up the more menial tasks. Never too much to ask of him. Without his continued support, drive and promotion of the women's game across the wider football community, it is likely that the inter-core women's team would not be where it is today. We all have a great memory of Stu, mostly in the pubs or clubs away from the football pitch, but just the mention of his name brings a smile to your face. He remained an ever-present at the annual Intercorps football comp and will be remembered as the greatest servant to Incorps women's football. The Player of the Tournament trophy has been named in his honour as the Stu Gregor-Ramsay Trophy, a very fitting tribute to a stalwart member of the women's team. In summary, he was just one of life's good eggs who really wanted the best for the women's game so that we could all share the same game he loved. Someone else said, I've just been reading back through these thoughts and I think you've hit the nail on the head. He was always there for you with a big soft cuddle, someone to lean into when it was needed. He knew how to read a room. His eyes sparkled bright with the enjoyment he got from making others feel happy and mentoring them through a situation. His laugh was infectious. And finally, I remember Stu just being a constant, either in the background or being our coach and manager through my time in the core team. He's so loved by all the girls he's ever coached, and he's had to put up with some things during his time with us. I think when anyone mentions Stu, they always connect him with the women's team. He was someone you could talk to about anything from periods to pregnancy. The girls felt he was a safe space whenever they needed to chat. Although he had a miserable face, I can attest to that. He really did have a miserable face. He always had a positive outlook. And when he was coaching, he gave encouragement to every player, no matter their experience or skill level. He always wanted players to give their best performance. And no matter what the score was, he only highlighted the good parts and adjusted his coaching style to improve players for the next game. He championed the women's game at both core and army level. He understood that women's sport was not seen in the same light as men's sport and used his influence to encourage women to take up opportunities in coaching and refereeing through the Army FA. His name is synonymous with the core women's football and he is so missed. My miserable Grinchy mate Stu, to finish off my brief as I started it, never knew or understood his impact. Like Helen, his loss is keenly felt and his legacy is clear. And I strive really to be half the human being that they both were in their short lives and endeavour to support others and champion them at every possible opportunity, building my legacy and hopefully making it easy for other people to write my eulogy when I too am gone. And that concludes my brief. Questions?
Amazing. Yes. Thank you for sharing, Vic. It's amazing. Has anyone got any questions? Okay, cool. Oh, have we got a question here? Yeah. Oh, just thank you for sharing. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Simon. Yeah, thank you. It was amazing that you know, we all have an opportunity to be leaders, and there's a lot of stuff you shared there about your personal journey, which I found really insightful. We have got a question. If you want to go ahead and ask, that'd be great.
Hi, Jenny Naylor here. I've kind of listening today kind of by accident. And the last thing I heard, last thing I thought I'd hear would be something about Stu Gregor-Ramsay, who I knew because I knew his ex-wife quite well, and I was serving in my husband's ex-Incorps. And yeah, you're right. Yeah, I guess it just made me think not just Stu, but of all the other men who have championed and been around. And yeah, it was just really good to hear. And I think, as you say, it's really important that remember that toxic behaviour can happen up as well as down.
Mm-hmm.
And there's I've seen quite a lot of strong male leaders, unfortunately, attempted females to take them down through toxic
Mm-hmm.
behaviour. And that's something that really hits me in the gut, especially because as an ex-female soldier you try so hard to change that methodology, but that's still unfortunately still happening quite presently. And I think it's up to us to kind of call that out and stand up for it, just as you're saying. But no, really glad that I accidentally came across it. And lovely to hear you talk about it too. Thank you.
Thank you.
There is a question here from Dawn in the comments saying, what 3 words would you like to pick for your legacy?
I think love has to be in there. Compassion, maybe, and friendship. I saw something the other day on, I think it was on Facebook. There was a meme, I think I shared it, and it talked about how I wonder if we measured our success not in kind of titles or degrees or whatever, but in the number of people that we make happy, or that we have made happy, or whatever. I wonder how we would feel if we did that. And I kind of thought that that's actually the right way round. People are often quite impressed by a list of all degrees I've got, but actually that I don't think that's impressive at all. I think what that hid is the fact that I had no confidence, and I stayed at home and did research, when what I probably should have been doing is getting out and about and living my life. But I just didn't have it in me back then. And so that isn't impressive. I feel like there are some impressive things about me, but perhaps people wouldn't see it that way. So I think I give to others quite a lot in the background, quietly, just do small things, particularly for my family and friends. I think that's probably the most impressive thing about me, but nobody really knows about it. So it did make me think about how we judge success, and whether success is about, I don't know, being in a position of power, responsibility, or leadership, or if it's about how we make other people feel. And maybe there's opportunity for it to be both, I don't know, but certainly it did make me think about that.
Is there any more questions? I think if that's it. So all of this has been recorded today, so we're going to put it on the website in the members area, so you can digest it, or perhaps share it with someone else who you feel would really benefit from watching this and listening to it. And we'll continue the conversation in the members chat area as well. Feel free to open any topics and any thoughts that this is kind of invoked for you. And yeah, let's keep talking about it.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
You know, I think as someone like myself, you know, so before I was doing this, I had my own agency for sort of the last 7 years. And at its peak, we had, I think, 30 something staff. Yeah, this talk and the previous talk and just being involved in it has made me think about different times where, you know, have I been the best that I could for the people around me? Did I empower in the right way? Did I hold people back, etc.? And it's definitely made me analyze some of it. And what you said earlier, you know, specifically about perhaps in our younger days. And for me, I specifically can recall letting somebody down and kind of throwing them under the bus. And this was in my early management kind of period where I didn't have the strength of the kind of leaders eat last type mentality. Yeah, instead of taking the blame, I passed it on. And I can see I've learned a lot since then, so I'm happy with that. But it's good that you know, all of these topics it's really important stuff. And even though it's not just about equality, it's you know, and gender, it's much more than that. It's good that it's all coming into the one space, and I think that's why it's good for everyone to get involved. And
Agreed.
and it's always, I don't know, it's when somebody like yourself, you just shared your story in quite a passionate way. You know, it's not, you didn't hold back your sharing, you know, your true experience. It's not for show. You know, that's important, and that's, you know, very nice, very kind of you to share. I enjoyed it.
Good. Well, I'm glad, and it's a pleasure to be asked, isn't it? I just hope I hope it's what, you know, because I really respect Jodie and Natalie, and sometimes when you're asked to do a talk, you don't really know if it's what the person who actually wanted from the talks. I just hope it's what they wanted, and it's okay for them, because I really want to support their efforts.
Yeah, you can see from the comments.
By the way, it's Dawn here. I didn't realise, I walked away from my phone, and I'm somehow still in your meeting.
Hello, lovely Dawn. How are you?
I'd just let you know it was really good, Vic, and also I really enjoyed what you just said. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Ed.
Oh, hi, Ed. We meet at last. I've emailed you. I actually really enjoyed what you just said as well, because I thought that was really powerful. And I don't know whether that's something that you would admit in front of other people and all the rest of it, but I think what you both have done today is just show that actually we're all people and we don't get it right all the time. And it's really, really important to hear that, so that people don't think, you know, that you're an unattainable person and I can't be as good as you kind of thing. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. So
Oh,
I think
thank
Bodhi would
you.
as well, if that helps.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dawn.
Right, lovely people. I'm going to go now because I'm going to go and work with all the special needs kids.
Cool. I'm gonna go and get some lunch.
You enjoy yourself. Lovely to see you.
You too.
Take care.
Bye.